getting good film emulations in digital is hard. And this is why a lot of times people are unsatisfied, is they'll buy a film emulation pack and just like most presets, good looking demo image, which is easy enough, but it looks nothing like that on their images. So I do an extensive amount of testing, especially on these film emulsions, because it's very complicated and subtle. I mean, sometimes we're moving a curve 1 point out of 255 just to try and balance out that color. So the Filmists emulsions are actually harder than probably any other ones that I make. And I will spend hours and hours and hours and hours refining a look like Portra, for example, which is just an emphasis of why presets are so important in a workflow, because I could never spend that much time getting a certain look if I was individually moving sliders. It would just be a pure waste of time. It would be plain stupid to work that way, which is why I invest a lot of time making really great formulas, and then I put those formulas out there for you. I'm going to show you guys the Filmist 1.5, but I'm really going to show you what I did with Portra. And if you don't have Filmist, if you do have Filmist, and you should have Filmist, head over to the site. I'll link it below, and support my channel by grabbing Filmist. But also there is a Portra look in the free version. You're gonna see things are kind of organized and improved. The mods up here, really emphasis on kind of chemical-based mods. The X-Soft glass mod to soften things down and give kind of that more vintage glass feel. X-Contrast push, darkroom vignette, a lot of new and or refined mods carrying over from version 1.3, which brought us things like the high ISO Filmic and the low ISO Filmic. So these are mods that can be added on top of any of the other presets that you see down below and not affect like your color, the tonal range bath, things like that. So these are meant to give you kind of that feel of how when you were developing an image in the darkroom, you might shift your processing, your chemicals and things like that. A lot of 1.5 updates here to just make these formulas better and more versatile. But let's go down and look at Portra, because we now have 4 versions of Portra, the 160, the 160 push, the 400, and the 800. So I've really emphasized Portra, and I've been working and working and working. When I start making a film, I try to look at those original film stock. So I could say, okay, here's an image I took on Portra 160, exposed a little bit on the heavy side. Here is an image of J. Meisel on Portra 400. You can see that really nice natural warmth of the Portra 400. These are on 4x5. This is actually Ektar, so that's a different formula. The problem in emulating film on digital is, number one, film is organic, it's silver, it's light sensitive. So it's not inherently the same. But yes, you can take an image on digital, you can take an image on Portra 400, you can take them into Lightroom or Capture One and tweak around and get them looking almost identical so that the average person, really no person, even an experienced photographer, would be able to tell, right down to grain and detail. The difficulty in making formulas is getting these to work on more than one image, because you tweak around and you get all your color looking good for one, and then you put it on another and you're like, why does it not work well? The problem is, even between rolls and batches of film, of Portra, of Ektar, but also the type of chemical, the temperature of the water. And this is something I used when I was developing, because I did a lot of my own 4x5 developing on black and white and in color. And so all these differences, even when you're developing film, somebody might say, no, Portra looks like this. And arguably, yeah, there is like a base standard, right? The problem is different labs and subtleties in the way you print and the way you scan, and all these variables make it different. So what I did to push this further is I studied a ton of Portra, and I watched videos on people using Portra, comparing Portra 160 to 400 to 800 to try and find the nuances, comparing Portra to digital, comparing different types of images, different lighting conditions, how the color profiles. And I really recommend, if you can, if you have the opportunity, go buy some Kodak Portra and go shoot film and go develop that film, because it's a really good experience. Sometimes people get offended when I do these emulations that respect film and that do these film emulations or platinum like an Emulsion 3, and they say, oh no, it's not real, it's not real. All of these things are artistic representations, and I'm trying to get as close as I can to these classic film stocks, because they're getting harder and harder to get. Some of them are not even available anymore, and they have a lot to teach us because of the color science that was in those. And so that's why I love Filmists. Let's go in and actually use these. I'm going to show you and tell you some of what I've learned about what's different about the different Portra films. Let's start with this image here, and I could apply any of these, right? There's a lot of really great. The new Chromax is updated. Chromax 400X is a very soft color. This is a brand new one. The Fuji Pro is always a favorite of mine, and I always come back to it. But there's all these different film stocks that give me a lot of different variables and that are gonna work really well. Go through and check these out, all the way down to the classic negatives, the Pola colors, the Provias, all of these. Play around, don't get stuck on one, because mixing up that color is really the beauty. That was the beauty of film, is we chose our film based on the nuances that we want. But for now, let's look at Portra. Now, if you look at the 160, it is very soft color, very gentle, very nuanced. The highlights roll off beautifully, and I put a lot of work into really trying to make this accurate and work on all kinds of images and all kinds of cameras. And we also have the Portra 160 push, which is a push, and when you push exposure, in real film, you get a difference in nuances and color. So you actually see this shift. It's not just exposure increased. In fact, none of these presets are affecting exposure, because a good preset should not affect exposure. This one's pushed and it brightens us up a little bit. Let's look at 400 though. So here's 160 and here's 400. 400 has a very different contrast blend. In my experience, 400 is a little less contrasty, while 800 is way more contrasty and leans a little bit more green and more saturated. The greens are much bolder in Portra 800. In fact, some might argue that it's not even the best for portraits in most situations, but each one of these also has their own separate grain that's being applied. So you're getting the subtleties of the ISO in these, and I've been doing a lot of refinement of that as well. You can see I'm really excited about these, because I think these are the best Portra emulations that you can get anywhere, and I'm really proud of these. And for a long time using Filmist, I would oftentimes go to the Fuji 400H and things like that, and Portra wasn't always my go-to, because Portra tends to have a green shift, a little bit of a green undertone that's difficult to replicate in digital, and sometimes I would be like, no, it's too green. Let's go down here, and I could go straight to 160 push without adjusting the exposure. And you can see, if you look here, there's no exposure adjustment here. So when I make a push tool like this, or the push or pull tools up here in the mods that you see, they're not adjusting exposure. They're using curves and other tools to dynamically and get a more organic kind of push that emulates more like the darkroom in terms of how it manages highlights and shadows. And now let's see what Portra 160 does. You can see that it's this very soft color. Now, of course, if I wanted to, I could go down to the bottom and I could do the Z mod and add more color. So I could do a more color mod and do it that way. I could also just go over here and add more saturation. And sometimes I think people start using film emulations and they think, oh, the color's kind of soft. Well, film has a much more natural, subtle color. Now, if you want that look, there's nothing wrong with going here to Portra 160 and then going over to your color slider and just boosting your saturation a little bit to find the balance that you need for that image. But don't be intimidated if the color is a little soft. Portra 160 has very soft color. In my experience in studying many variants and many photographers talking about this, as well as using it myself, there's a bit of kind of a magenta undertone with a green hue to it that's very complicated and difficult to define, because it honestly seems different in different lighting conditions. Let's go to Portra 400, and you can see here we have a very soft grain reminiscent of 160. If we go to 400, the contrast is actually even a little bit lower. In my experience, 400, which is probably the most popular Portra, is a little bit more warm. It has a little bit less of the green tone, a little bit more of a warmth to it that is generally very pleasing and very versatile. You'll see here that we have a little bit more grain on the 400, very organic feel. And again, you can add a mod, or you can just crank your saturation if you feel like, oh, based on my lighting, I need a little bit more here. I don't recommend pushing that too far. And in the actual formulas, in the presets, I always try to get it as close to the original film as I can, and as much as you can define that, because I'm studying, when I say original film, we're talking about scans, we're talking about prints that I may have made, we're talking about looking at what I got from my original negatives, and then looking now at all these other image makers and videos being made about these different film stocks to try and get a balanced perspective that really works. And that really helped me. I can tell you this, if you're tinkering with film formulas, not getting stuck on my demo samples that I had, side by sides of, and that were my own images, and actually going out and watching content from other great photographers on their experiences and what they feel and their development processes, and just looking at different blogs and things and seeing these Portra emulations I'm sorry, not emulations, original Portra images from the film, comparing that with my own original film images, and then going back to here. Okay, so here is our 400, and then you can also see that we have the 800. The 800, it does look good here. You can see the 800 is strongly more contrasted, and this is consistent with how Portra 800 is. So 800, obviously we're gonna have much more grain, but it's still very pleasing, and we're going to have a very balanced kind of mix going on here. And it's the same here. If we go through these different images, you can see that I can pretty much now apply Portra. Here is a very subtle color. Even though we're in a sunset, we're getting a very soft, natural color, which I can push up if I want to. But I think I'm gonna like a little bit more warmth on this. And so let me go to 400 or maybe even 800 on this, because it's gonna push my contrast here, which is gonna look really lovely on this image. I do wanna give you a tip. And I've told you this before, that good presets don't adjust white balance. If you make a preset that's white balance base to give you a tint, when you apply it to another image, it's most of the time not going to work, because the white balance needs for that image are completely different because it was shot in different lighting conditions. So you can't use white balance on a color image in a preset and expect it to work on others, which is why you'll always see my presets leaving white balance alone. However, I'm gonna give you a tip. If I say run Portra 160 push on this lovely image here, one of the quickest ways, if you say, oh, the color's not right, it feels a little green, it doesn't mean that your formula was bad, that the preset's bad. It means your lighting conditions might not have been neutral, and that's fine. On digital, we don't have to worry about white balance, as I just showed you in the white balance video a few weeks ago. Check that out, because I think it was a good video. What you can just do here is just gently adjust your white balance. So I'm like, oh, it feels a little too green and not saturated, okay? Before I jump to pushing up the saturation, I'm actually gonna tweak with my white balance just a little bit. And you can see here that we now have, from the 160, it looks great. And it'll probably look great on 400, although a little bit red and warmer, which is consistent, and even more so on 800. 800 isn't actually warmer. It actually, in my experience, tends to shift more towards the greens and more cyans, but it's much more contrasty. So it brings things out in a very different way. If you scroll through the Filmist looks, whether they be Ektar or Fuji or Natura or any of these, and some of my favorites for soft color, like the Agfa Flex looks, are just really beautiful. Mix up those varieties. But what I'm really excited about with the new Portra looks in Filmist 1.5 is that they're just working. So I can go here and say, all right, now this is after sunset, here's Portra 160. I'm gonna push my white balance and bring in some of that warmth just a touch, and look at the subtlety of this. But I might say, no, I want a little bit more, because this is after sunset, I want a little more warmth. I'm actually gonna push it into Portra 400, which I like a little bit better. And in this case, because it's so soft, something we couldn't easily do in the dark room, I'm going to push my saturation just a little bit more, and it just looks really good. Now, if I do Portra 800 on this, it also looks good. So you're gonna see a theme in these new images that I think you're going to enjoy, is that regardless of the scene, here's a session I actually did last night, backlit. I was loving the atmospheric haze, very low contrast, but you know what? I can push any of the Portras on these, and it just feels amazing, okay? I think, again, 160 push or 400, but 160 push kind of brings that pop a little bit out on this session, this birthday session that I did. And I'm gonna pull my blacks down manually a little bit, because obviously the preset doesn't know how much atmospheric I got in there. We can see the insects and the bugs, and it's just mixing all in with the grain. So this comes in kind of very soft and hazy. I'm gonna push my saturation just a little bit, which you can also do from the Quick Mod preset that's right down at the bottom of Filmist, but sometimes I just go into the slider. There's nothing wrong with using your sliders. And so this here is my 160 push, and you can see here's our original, and here's this, just really bringing out those warm tones and really working. And no, you don't have to limit your Portra use to portraits. It is Portra, but lots of people shoot landscapes and other scenes, street photography, things like that. So play with these and have some fun with them. Let's do the Portra 800. But then let's do our white balance. Let's fix our white balance a little bit and warm it up just a touch, all right? So you can see that the theme here is that we're getting really, really good combinations of these. Now, I might go through on a landscape and say, well, I have all these films at my disposal in Filmist. Maybe I like one a little bit better than Portra. And actually, Color Pro 400 is working really good on this right now. Here's our original, and here's this one. I'm just gonna pull my highlights down a little bit more, and I'm gonna put the new darkroom vignette on there. And I can go down here to the vignette if it's a little too much, and just go right down here to the post-crop vignette and dial it up just a little bit to about 25 instead of 36. And there we go. So we're from here to here. And I hope you guys will try all 3 of these Portras, compare them to other tools, to your experience shooting the real thing, and send me your feedback. Leave it in the comments, hit that like button, subscribe if you guys enjoyed this. I'm really excited about the emulations and where Filmist is going and how it just keeps getting better. And the new Portras really avoid that look that a lot of times these things, presets and tools fall into. They say, oh, this is this film or this is that film. And if you know those films and then you run the preset, you're like, no, the emulsions in Filmist that are in there to emulate a real world film, I do the best I can to get those dialed in. And I really took that to the next level in this 1.5 update. Let me guys know how you like Portra, what you find about its characteristics, if you've shot it or if you've tried to emulate it digitally. And if you know any great comparisons or videos or articles that you've seen that maybe I haven't, please drop those in the comments, because I'm going to keep researching, and as we keep going forward with Filmist, it's just going to keep getting better and better. Regardless of whether you're using these in Capture One, in Lightroom, in LUTs as well, although bear in mind when you're using LUTs, they don't apply grain and things like that because it's not the same as a raw editor, but your color profiles and your tones still should come out beautifully. In fact, most of my video editing in Resolve, if I color grade with Filmist LUTs or with natural HDR LUTs occasionally, because I also make those as a LUT pack, but I have to say Filmist LUTs are my favorite. You should see pretty good consistency with these between Lightroom and Capture One, and just be able to really pull out that filmic natural look, whether you're using Portra or any of the other films in Filmist. Head over and download Filmist 1.5. At least go download the free mini pack, and I'll put a link to that in the comments. And I hope that you'll support the channel and the ongoing research of these, and check out the complete pack of Filmist. I'm feeling good about this right now because these are working. As you can see across all these images, it was just working. And that is what a film emulation should do. All right, you guys, peace. We'll see you next time.